in the UK, we don't really use the word Larry, but once I was interviewed on Fox News for my sins. And I was staring down the camera in London, waiting for the presenter to announce me, and somebody said, I'd like to introduce, I don't know, to talk about Samsung's latest earnings, Larry Luddy. And so I was just staring down the camera, not realizing or recognizing my name for about 30 seconds, the most embarrassing moment of my life. So yes, I'm used to Larry now. So yes, my name's Lawrence Lund Bryan. I took my wife's surname, so now I have to say Lund Bryan, which is very odd. But it's good. And so essentially, I head up research at Outlier Ventures. Outlier Ventures is a venture capital firm for this sort of decentralized web. And to be honest, this presentation will present probably more questions than we have answers, because I think everybody is trying to figure out what is the role of venture capital in this new ecosystem where, frankly, capital is abundant. And if capital is abundant and can be raised from token sales, what is the role of a venture firm? And we're trying to figure that out. And one of the things that we as a firm tried to understand is, look, we have a vision of a future. We think the future in 10 years' time will look like, well, I'll show you in a moment. And what we want to do is we want to push it out there as early as possible, minimum viable research, get it out there, get as much feedback as possible, and try to co-create this future with startups and entrepreneurs and to fund them to do that. So a lot of the work we do is actually less in giving people money. It's actually far more in trying to understand new business models that are emerging from the decentralized web, trying to understand the legal ramifications, try to understand the crypto economics side of things, all very new and nascent. And we work and partner with our founders to try and figure that out. So our vision of the future is something we call the Convergence Ecosystem, which frankly is pretty much exactly what this whole day is about. And it's to try and understand each of these technologies in a non-siloed way. So 2 years ago, when I joined the firm to develop the investment framework, it became very clear to me that blockchains as the software class or a database was far more interesting than just finance. And at the time, everyone was just very, very interested in how it would relate to finance and supply chain transparency and the like. And what we realized was, I think we saw it as a new distribution channel. We saw blockchains and distributed ledgers as a new way of transferring data. And that seemed far more profound than just being able to whilst peer-to-peer digital economy is very, very important, and maybe the single biggest thing that comes out of this so-called blockchain space, we feel like there's an element here to data. How does data move around? How is it transported? So we saw it fitting into a broader framework. And that broader framework, for simplicity's sake, is very much the Internet of Things, blockchains, and artificial intelligence. And as a researcher, I'm loath to simplify it to such a degree, but our head of marketing keeps forcing me to do so. But there we are. So I'm going to talk through the sort of the layer in which, or our vision at the end. I'll sort of show you a pretty diagram that we tried to pull together. But fundamentally, we think that blockchains are part of a broader data value chain that's emerging. And at the bottom of that is, how is data produced? So at the bottom layer is, how is data produced and how does it enter the ecosystem? So by that, what we mean is, if we think about the Internet of Things or large sensor networks, they're all throwing out so much data, and we can all talk about zettabytes of data that's being produced. And in a few years, we're talking about chairs that will have sensors and mattresses and digestibles and all sorts of different data that will be produced. But we simply don't have the infrastructure today to manage that data. Sure, we can collect it, but all that happens if we're retrofitting old existing data infrastructure is it ends up in a server somewhere, and very few companies or institutions know how to deal with that. They might just be collecting it, and GDPR actually sort of supercharges this, and people are starting to think about, well, why are we holding this data, and what are we doing with it? And not everybody had the answer yet. And so we think that this bottom layer is how data enters this convergence ecosystem. It's through the Internet of Things, it's through software, it's through our sort of data exhaust. It's all how data is pulled in. And what we think actually is blockchains form this distribution layer, this new sort of open, in some cases public, but as Guy mentioned, hopefully some elements of it will be private. But this is a new distributed, decentralized data layer. And so we ask the questions, how is data authenticated? How is it validated? How is it secured and stored off-chain, on-chain? And the answers are being experimented on daily, right? All of this stuff is new and emerging, and everybody's tinkering with parts of this. And so does it need to be a fully permissionless ledger? Can it be permissioned, for example? Can certain use cases might require permission ledgers with identity embedded in? An example would be, say, Sovereign, which Outlier invested in, but it's a permissioned public ledger for self-sovereign identity. So there might be new ways in which data is authenticated or new ways in which it's secured. But fundamentally, if you take a step back, what we think is this all forms a new distribution layer for data. And then finally, and this is where the AI component comes in, is how is that data turned into insight? How is it consumed? So there's lots of questions around the problems with runaway AI and AI decision-making and black box neural networks. And that is all the case. But if we start to use a distribution layer which has data provenance and it has security that's embedded in, and we have smart contracts, I mean, we can automate a lot of the things and we can create insights, but from secure, validated data. So we think that's the sort of the new value ecosystem. It's production, distribution, and consumption of data. Now, that all sounds very automated and all very technological. And I think my personal background being, that's having studied politics and being from the political realm, is we were missing this human component. Nodes can create automated consensus, but nodes are just a part of this broader ecosystem, and we need to start thinking more broadly around governance and around the human element. And I think that's the part of this ecosystem that's often missed in the blockchain ecosystem, and it's the part that we want to focus on most. So we call that the governance layer that goes around that data ecosystem. And that's the questions, again, and I'm proposing more questions necessarily than answers, because when the market and developers around the world are able to solve a lot more problems than we want to suggest one thing that people need to do, we literally want to ask the questions and get smart people to come to us with the answers. And so that's what we're saying. We're saying, how are the protocols and communities governed and incentivized? This comes from a thought. Bitcoin, as the first and currently most successful blockchain ecosystem, has a very clear value system: libertarianism, censorship resistance. And that is probably the value system that's required for the use case that they're trying to solve. But there are other political leanings, there are other values for which people will care about more than censorship resistance. For example, I know of a few projects that are trying to do social democratic blockchain. So, for example, trying to embed in UBI directly into the network. And so the token that you hold might not be such a good store of value as holding Bitcoin. But of course, if you truly believe in a world in which you need universal basic income or a better wealth distribution, what better network for you to engage with? So I think there's lots of questions to be answered around new values that will uphold a lot of these new protocols and networks. And actually, in a world of interoperability, in a world in which value can be traded over blockchains seamlessly with atomic swaps or seamlessly with decentralized exchanges, why would you hold one token over another? Sure, one might be for a store of value, but another might be for access to a certain decentralized computing like Gnosis or Golem. But it also might be because you believe in that network, right? I mean, why do people hold Bitcoin? I mean, if they truly believe in it, it's quite religious, if anything. The same with Ethereum, the same with IOTA, the same with a lot of these networks. There's something more than just a store of value in it. It's a lot more around a personal belief and a value system. And I think that's something that's missing at the moment. That's why this human component is so important. There's a huge missing gap here in valuation methods and digital currencies. We need to talk about why people are holding it for far more reasons than just because they necessarily think it will go up in value and they'll be rich. Sure, a lot of people are. But there are others that want to be involved in this ecosystem that have different beliefs. So finally, I'm going to leave you with the graph that we tried to put together. Again, it's minimum viable research. So the reason why we did this is we wanted to put it up there for feedback. We want people to say, that's wrong because this will solve it, or that's right, but have you thought about X, Y, Z? And so this is the way in which we see the future, and these are the companies and areas of technologies and protocols that we want to help co-create and invest in. And you'll see here the bottom layer, as I mentioned, data collection. Then how is it authenticated, validated, and secured? How things like ledgers, consensus mechanisms, identity, storage. How is it transported? Data interoperability or state communications. Then how is it sold? Marketplaces, how is it consumed? You know, AI data marketplaces like Ocean, or IoT data marketplaces like IOTA. And then finally, this top layer, what we would call AI, but we call, because it's a research paper, not a marketing paper, process, analyze, and automate. Not quite as catchy. But smart contracts and distributed compute and decentralized machine learning. All of these really interesting new technologies, but the idea of the paper that this is pulled out from, and the idea of the chart, is to say we think this is a bigger holistic picture, and these can't be seen as siloed technologies. Hey, we're going to make an IoT investment, or we want to investigate IoT, or we want to investigate artificial intelligence. It's part of this much broader trend, and I think it's an emerging data ecosystem. So the research is available on outlierventures.io/research to just download the paper. And I think the one thing I just wanted to reiterate, and I always say at the end of these talks, is that the future is created by developers, and it is created by technologists, at least when it comes to many of these technologies. But actually, if you put it in this broader framework, we need to engage ethicists. We need to engage in economists, which we already are here, luckily, but I see that very, very rarely. We need to make sure we have a diverse view and range of opinions on many of these technologies and the implications of it. Because otherwise, we end up down a road where we think we're connecting everyone around the world, and you end up fostering discontent in civil wars in Myanmar, for example. So I think whilst everybody might say this seems really far away, this is 5, 10 years away, but no, because if we're creating the technologies now and we embed smart contracts or artificial intelligence, then we need to have ethicists. We need to have governance models in place to start thinking about this. So that is the last thing I'd like to mention. Thank you very much.